Hey there, it's John Moore here, and I'm a shamanic teacher and practitioner, and I'm coming to you. It is early morning, it's dark outside, it's rainy, having a little bit of shamanic go juice, or as I like to refer to it, coffee. It's early here. It's cold. It's a fall day. It's stormy. I actually really love weather, and so um, I'm sitting here by my glass door watching the weather. But today, I want to talk to you about three the three main shamanic worlds. And you might be familiar with this, but the shamanic journey, which is the main practice in shamanism, is when a shamanic practitioner enters an altered state of consciousness. I use drumming or rattles to drive a particular state of mind, and part of us leaves our body and we're able to travel in what's called non-ordinary reality, these non-ordinary states of reality. And there are three main worlds that we travel in. And one is called the upper world, one's called the middle world, and one's called the lower world. As you might imagine, those, the experience of traveling to them is usually going up or going down or what have you. But I do want to be clear about what these are and where they are, because there can be a lot of misconceptions, particularly if you come from, say, a Christian background, as I grew up in a Christian household and whatever, and we think heaven is up and hell is down, and so the lower world is an evil place, and that isn't true. It's not equivalent at all to heaven and hell. The upper world is not where you go when you die, and the lower world is also not where you go when you die. Although in many cultures and many traditions, that has been the case. That the afterlife is generally down. So in Norse belief, for example, the word hell comes from the goddess Hel, and it also refers to the underworld where people who die go to, and it's not a fiery place of torture. That was just sort of adopted by Christians later, that term to refer to the place you go if you're a bad person. The Greeks also, the dead went to the underworld, right? And you crossed the river Styx and wound up where you were going. But other cultures have different places they go when they die. Some go to the west, some go up, some what have you. So these are cultural norms, and I will do a video later on about how what happens after you die and how our cultural expectations inform the experience of that. But I want to get back to the shamanic worlds. So I will start with the lower world, because that's usually the first place you would learn to journey to when you are learning how to journey. So the lower world is reached by kind of, going down through the earth, and you wind up in a place that is very natural. There are oceans and beaches and fields and jungles and everything you can imagine, very natural. There are also structures there, but there are a lot of animal spirits there. This is where power animals reside most of the time. They can travel between worlds, and they can show up in our lives when we're not in the lower world. But this is where we meet them for the first time, in the lower world. This is where a shaman will retrieve a power animal from you by bringing it from the middle world to be connected with you where you live. And I'll talk about that in a minute. So it is, if you have this conception that the lower world is this fiery place where demons torture you and all that thing, it is absolutely nothing like that, at least not in the shamanic conception of things. And obviously the upper world is where, to get there, you have an experience of traveling up, and it is a little more amorphous, cloudy, the stereotypical things you see in like movies and TV shows where it's heaven, where you're walking around and it's very cloudy. But there are structures there. You would meet helping spirits there who are, perhaps deceased people or religious figures or, more archetypal figures, for lack of a better term. They're not really archetypes because archetypes are formless. These things have sort of spiritual form, and I'll talk about form and formlessness as well. So that leaves the middle world. So the middle world is where we live. We live in the middle world. So, if you think about Middle Earth from Lord of the Rings or Midgard from Norse mythology or what have you, we're smack in the middle. And there is, however, when we talk generally about the middle world, we're talking about the spiritual component of the ordinary world that we live in on a day-to-day basis. This is why spirits can kind of occupy the same space. And they're, from a shamanic perspective, everything is spirit, but some things have physical representation. And it's really about density. So when I hold up this mug has physical mass, and so it is dense, so it has a representation in the physical realm in what we call ordinary reality. But in non-ordinary reality, if I were to journey into non-ordinary reality, I would also see this mug, but it would be the spiritual aspect of this mug. Or I would see the spiritual aspect of myself if I were, observing myself or whatever. And there are lots and lots of things in ordinary or not in non-ordinary reality in the middle world that don't have physical representation. So these things are like nature spirits. You might have things like fairies and elves and gnomes and all these creatures, these sort of what we think of as mythological creatures, have an existence in the middle world and have been here longer than humans have. And some of them live very close to ordinary reality. They live kind of in a frequency that's very close to ordinary reality that lets them sometimes pop in or lets us sometimes observe them. This is what happens with what we would consider ghosts as well, that sort of thing. So all of those things that are normally invisible to us but still exist on this plane, and there are lots of them. Like every culture in the world has quote unquote little people, right? So in Hawaii they have the menehune. In Europe we had trolls and elves and pixies and fairies and sprites and brownies and everything you can think of. And in West Africa they have the candomblé. In Pacific Islands they have all kinds of different sort of little people that can have supernatural powers and can disappear at will and all of these things. And these are nature spirits, and there are many different species of nature spirit around, and there are spirits of place. So where you live, you have house spirits. In the olden times in Greece, pre-Christianity, you would have a house demon. And the word demon just meant spirit. You had bad demons and good demons, and until Christianity came along and made anything having to do with spirits diabolical, right? Having to do with the devil, having to do with hell, having to do with damnation, all of these things. But that was not the original belief or meaning of that word. And so these spirits, as we encounter them here, all live in the middle world. So how does this happen? What is the sort of dynamics or physics of how this works? So the way I like to explain it is, as I'm sitting in this room, there is a signal from, there are signals in this room from every radio station on the planet. Obviously, if there are radio stations that are completely across the world from me, those signals would be very, very weak. Radio stations that are close to me, those signals would be very, very strong. Also, the laptop I'm recording this on has, is giving off radio signals. Those are in the same room. The router that it's connected to gives off its own radio signals, and that's in the same room. And all of these signals coexist, and more or less don't interfere with each other if they're on different frequencies. So these worlds, though we perceive them as being different physical locations because it's easy for our brains to make sense of that, are actually on different spiritual frequencies. And so what we're doing when we travel to them in journey is we're turning the radio dial on our spirit so that we can perceive these other worlds. So things that do not have mass, such as spirit, and there's sort of a spectrum of things, right? Some things are much more closer to having mass. Some spiritual things don't really have physical form, but they're really, really close because they live on a frequency that's very close to the physical. And those are things like spirits that we can perceive in the middle world. And sometimes those spirits can affect physical reality because they're very close in frequency. And then there are some spirits that have the ability, that don't live close to physical reality, but have the ability to sort of change and affect physical reality to some degree or another. But it is much harder for them to do that because it requires a lot of energy, or it requires a lot of skill, or what have you. So we are turning the frequency, but we perceive it. Our brains make sense of it because we are used to seeing things in 3D reality, where things have form and shape and color and all of these things. So most people, when they journey, see visuals. Not everybody. And there are some people who are what we call aphantasic. They don't make pictures in their head, but they're still able to journey because they receive input from other senses. But what's happening is when we tune our consciousness to these other realms, the information that's coming to us is not coming through our physical senses. It's coming through our non-physical senses, which we have many of. But our consciousness, our brains, are, in order to make sense of them, in order to make sense of these realms and the individuals that we encounter there and the things that we see, turns them into places, physical places. I go up, I go down. The truth is, there is not travel. We know if you go up in a rocket ship, you wind up in outer space. You don't wind up in the upper world. And if you were to bore down into the earth, you don't find the lower world there. You find rock and magma and whatever else is down there. Oil, diamonds. And so it's, the up and down is a metaphor for tuning the consciousness to different frequencies. The other thing to understand about these worlds is that one is not better than the other. The upper world is not better than the lower world. Neither is better than the middle world. We journey to them for different purposes. And that will be very individualistic depending upon the shaman who is doing the work. There are things that are only accomplished in the middle world. For example, if you were journeying to find a lost item, for example, which some shamans do that would be middle world work. As long as the item was physical. If I were to lose my coffee cup and I wanted to find it and perform a shamanic journey, I would journey in the middle world and locate that coffee cup. Because it has a physical presence and a spiritual presence in the middle world, it probably does not have it probably doesn't have much of a presence in the lower world. And it also wouldn't, the lower and upper world wouldn't give me a sense of location because they're not close enough to physical reality. Physical form comes from items having, in physical reality and ordinary reality, Physical form comes from items having mass, right? And we know about mass, the number of, atoms in something, molecules and what have you. And I won't get too much into physics, but we do know that time and space are very directly related to mass. That is, Einstein's theory of relativity, right? Basically, that time and space and mass are directly connected. So if time passes differently in outer space than it does close to the Earth, because the gravity created by the mass of the Earth actually changes time. It's a little mind-bendy, but it's true. So when we go to, when we're traveling to places that have no mass or in spiritual form that is not really close to mass, things are formless, and time and space really kind of break down, which is why shamanic healing can work at long distances. I don't have to put my hands on a person to perform shamanic healing, unlike some other healing modalities. And this is not I'm not putting any other healing modalities down. They're all good. But some energy healing modalities require you to put your hands on a person because of the way that they work. Shamanic healing works on the level of the astral or soul body primarily, although there are definitely some other things going on there, but primarily we're working on, doing some repairs to the energy body or doing repairs to the astral. And those things are formless. They don't have mass. The astral is super formless. The causal is way more formless than that. The etheric has a little more form. So these are like levels of human existence that are different spiritual densities, for lack of a better term. I don't know if I just coined spiritual density, but maybe somebody else uses that term as well. But because of that, distance doesn't matter and time doesn't matter. So frequently, shamans will do past life healing or ancestral healing. They'll go up your ancestral line and heal your great grandfather or your 16th great grandfather from some spiritual wound incurred back then, which will provide because you have a connection, will provide some sort of healing for you in this lifetime, because time gets really weird in spiritual realms. Someday I'll do a talk about divination, about shamanic divination at some point, and talk about things like predicting the future and how and is it possible to predict the future, and if it is, why can't I win the lottery? I've been working on the shamanism thing for years. Why haven't I won Powerball yet and retired with my $500 million to some island? I'll talk about that in a future video. So make sure you subscribe. Make sure you like this video and all of those things, and you'll find out when that video comes out. So those are the three main shamanic worlds. Now, that being said, again, those are just sort of a general band of frequencies. So like with electromagnetic frequencies, we have radio waves and we have light waves and we have X-rays and gamma rays and all of these things. And those are different frequencies on the electromagnetic spectrum, or they're different bands. So what we consider visible light is one band and radio is another band, but they're all on the same electromagnetic spectrum. So upper world, lower world, middle world, these are bands of frequencies, of spiritual frequencies, just like radio, light, and X-rays, and microwaves, and whatever else. And so within those, there are finer and finer and finer divisions. And so I can go to the lower world, but I can go to different realms of the lower world, and I can actually journey from the lower world to worlds below that, and I can journey from the upper world to worlds above that. These are just finer tunings depending on the work that I want to do. And there are actual projects going on with groups of shamanic practitioners to map out the landscape of the lower world. I don't know that they'll ever finish because As far as I know, it's pretty infinite, but there are common features that people run into, and I have in fact met other shamanic practitioners during Journey in a place that we could both draw a map of and overlay them, and they would be identical. So we're experiencing the same stuff there, the same landscape, the same structures, and and in fact I have done that with another shamanic practitioner. When we were seeing the same things, we both drew a map of what we were seeing, and it was identical. So it's tough to make that stuff up. So it's not that those things are suddenly having form. It's that our minds are similar enough that we're interpreting the same stimulus the same way. So those are the worlds: upper world, lower world, middle world, the main worlds, and a little bit about how they exist and how they coexist and where they are in spiritual space, and a little bit about the sort of the frequency explanation of how that works. I hope this has been informative. Again, I hope you'll subscribe and like this video, and I've got more to come. I'm very excited and passionate, as you can tell, about spreading my love of shamanism to other people. With that, I will leave you. I hope you stay happy and healthy.